You want to hop in to calls?
Let's hop in.
Let's do it. Let's start with Jonathan in Boston. Jonathan, you're live with Eric and V. Hey, doing all right. What do you want to talk about?
Great. So I want to talk about Jesus fulfilling the Old Testament. And there's various places throughout the Gospels where there are events in the life of Jesus that correlate in some way with things we see in the Old Testament. For example, Jesus' death coinciding with the Feast of Passover,
Sure.
which, given the theological import of that, is quite striking.
Yeah.
Okay?
So let's can I ask a couple questions?
Of course.
If I were to, let's say, be motivated to see a prophecy come true, and I know that prophecy ahead of time, and I want it to fit my narrative, and I wrote it down, is that anything but unremarkable?
Well, you accept that Jesus was crucified around the time of Passover, do you not?
No.
So I'm limiting my argument to cases where scholars are universally agreed upon the facts in question.
So, Jonathan,
or where there's
are scholars universally agreed on the historicity and inerrancy of the Bible?
No.
Okay, so if we're talking about a book that you need to fact check, then I'm not going to take things, just as a given. I'm going to ask about them. So let me ask you something else really quick. If I give you like a totally benign fact, right? Let's say, I've pointed to the Book of Eric. In the Book of Eric, it says 2 + 2 = 4, and I flew yesterday. Just because I found a true thing in it, does that mean that everything else in that book is true?
No.
Okay, so even if I granted you, let's say I granted you your prophecies, does that mean that Jesus fulfilled miracles?
No.
Okay. Does that mean that Jesus was Son of God?
It's an argument for, so we have a number of contending hypotheses. When it comes to an event in Jesus' life which correlates in some way with the Old Testament, we have 4 contending hypotheses I would maintain. We have one that is mere coincidence, or second, that it's design on the part of the human authors, or thirdly, it's design on the part of God orchestrating the history, or fourthly, it's design on the part of Jesus making himself fulfill those texts. Would you agree with that?
What do you think, V?
I mean, for the sake of this argument, let's go with those 4. I mean, I'm sure I could imagine a 5th, but I'm willing to narrow it down. I mean, I don't know off the top of my head. I just wouldn't commit to only those 4, but...
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, for the sake of this argument, let's narrow it down to those 4.
Okay. So the coincidence hypothesis seems unlikely, given that it's extremely improbable that, Jesus isn't likely to be able to engineer his death at the time of Passover.
So wait, we're basing these off of their probability and how likely they are to happen? That seems like a dangerous road to go down if you're going to be arguing that Jesus is the Son of God. Right?
What's your point? I don't understand your point.
Well, my point is, if you're saying, well, it couldn't be coincidence because that's too out there and improbable, how are you going to make a case that it's more probable that it was a God that did it? And that...
Well, we're looking for evidence of design. This seems to be the product of orchestration. I frame arguments in terms of Bayes' theorem, where evidence is defined as you've got evidence for your hypothesis H if and only if the probability of your evidence is greater given the hypothesis than given the annulment of that hypothesis.
Okay, so can I ask you a question, Jonathan?
Yeah.
Bayes' theorem, right? I've heard that brought up, and every time I've heard that brought up, tell me if this is how you're using it. Here are a whole bunch of things that I consider evidence, but on their own don't stand up. But together, for some reason, they do, because there's a lot of them.
Right.
So if you stack bullshit high enough, you can climb on top. Give me each of them, and I guarantee we can talk about them to the degree that you'll probably agree it's crap. The question is why you still hold on to it. That's not Bayes' theorem. That's not how that works. The way it works is that you actually look at good evidence, and that's what you hold on to, and you throw out the bad.
Do you accept that what can in principle be accomplished with a single piece of strong evidence can, in principle, also be accomplished by lots of pieces of weak evidence.
What do you mean by weak evidence?
So where the base factor is slightly top-heavy, but not extremely top-heavy.
Okay, so let's use the Bible as an example. In the book, it says it's true. How many pieces of evidence outside of that book point to it being true?
What particular claim are you talking about?
The inerrancy of it. The claims that are factually made about it. Or do you not think that the Bible is inerrant?
I'm not making an argument for the inerrancy of the Bible here.
Okay. Do you not think that it's inerrant? Maybe I'm wrong here.
I don't consider myself a dogmatic inerrantist or an a priori inerrantist. There's several cases in the Gospels where I think there's a probable case of a good faith error.
Okay, so at what point do you discern what's true from not true in that book, and how can we follow that line?
The evidence.
Okay. Do you know about walking on water? Is that a thing that we've been able to do as a species?
No.
How about spitting in somebody's eye to make them see again, or casting a demon into legion into a bunch of pigs, talking donkeys?
The point is that these are singularities, because Jesus is not any ordinary human, right? He's divine.
What does a divine look like?
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, you seem pretty confident in talking about what a divine is. How many do you know? Can you show me them? Can I inspect them? Can I tell what a divine looks like apart from a non-divine? Maybe I can bring up somebody else who said that they have, magic claims, cult leaders who've claimed to have risen from the dead, or people who have claimed to, perform miracles in the names of other deities and religions. How do I tell them from your Jesus, and how do you tell them apart?
Well, Jesus claimed to be God, and he claimed that his resurrection from the dead would be the vindication of his messianic and divine self-claims. So the fact that Jesus rose from the dead is strong evidence for the veracity of his claims. It's not proof of his claims, but it's strong evidence for his claims, because it's far more surprising.
I agree. It says that in the book.
Yeah.
I agree. It says that in the book. Can you please give me a reason to open the book? I'm asking for extra biblical evidence, something that actually points to the Bible being reliable.
Why does it need to be extra biblical evidence?
Well, because my example is my book. I bring out my book and I say my book is true because it says it's true. How do you prevent yourself from falling into the same error?
Right, but you can provide confirmation from within the Bible itself, because the Bible's not a single book. But I mean, the New Testament.
Actually, I'm holding it right here.
Books. Right. The New Testament is 27 separate books.
Right. The issue here that we're coming up against is, say we have you on one line saying that the Bible is true and proves itself, and all you need, and you don't need extra biblical anything to verify it. And then on the other line, we have a Muslim who's saying that the Quran is by itself all you need to prove that Islam is true. And here I am in the middle saying, okay, so you're saying your book is true. This person's saying their book is true. How do I know based on that? Because you're both bringing the same kind of evidence, your book. The way that I would determine who was true and who was closer to accuracy would be using extra biblical or extra book sources to determine whether or not you were speaking accurately.
Right, but we need to look at the specific evidences that both parties are offering. So let's give an example of a piece of evidence that confirms something biblical from within the Bible.
So okay? Can it be summed up as, in the book it says it's going to happen, and then in the book it says it happened? No. Okay, go ahead.
So have you heard of the phenomenon of undesigned coincidences?
I have not.
Is it on its face what I think it is? You know, you're thinking about the number 7, so you look for the number 7 everywhere, and lo and behold, you find it? No?
A ridiculous argument. So undesigned coincidences is when you have multiple accounts that concern an event, and the accounts interlock in a way that points to truth. So to give an illustration, in the Gospel of John, chapter 6, and verse 5, we have the setup for the feeding of the 5,000 miracle, and Jesus turns to Philip to ask, where do we send the people to buy bread? And that raises the question on the mind of the audience, why does he turn to Philip here in particular? Well, if you turn over to John chapter 12, 6 chapters later, a different context, it mentions in passing that Philip is from the town of Bethsaida in Galilee. In Luke's Gospel, chapter 9, the parallel of the feeding of the 5,000, although it doesn't mention Jesus turning to Philip, it just mentions he spoke to the disciples, it does mention that the event took place at Bethsaida. A detail that's not given by John. And so we put pieces together and then...
Okay, but here's the problem with that. I could say on February 2nd, 2020, V took a lift and got dropped off at the ACA and then helped a friend move. And then Austin was quarantined because the coronavirus was spotted and everybody there could not go anywhere else. And then aliens came and gave us a cure. And then someone else says, hey, do you remember when V went to the ACA on the 2nd of February? That bit is believable, right? That bit happened. That doesn't qualify the rest of the story.
I was wondering where you were going with that. Okay.
I'm spinning a narrative in my head here.
You lost me at aliens, to be honest.
That was the point.
Yeah. No.
Saying that I showed up at the ACA today, multiple people verifying that, does not prove the outlying story that aliens came to Austin, is my point. So you can't say, well, they both spoke of Bethsaida. Sure, it was a real place. Real people were there. I'm willing to grant that. But saying that doesn't give me any grounds to believe in anything that would require more evidence.
So I agree with you. I was giving that as an illustration to show how you don't need extra biblical evidence to corroborate details in the Bible.
No, we do, because we need to know that Bethsaida is a real place and that people lived there during that time. That stuff you correlate outside the Bible.
But that's not the argument. The argument is that we've confirmed or provided evidence for Jesus turning to Philip at the feeding of the 5,000 scene from John 6:5.
Hey, John?
And so that...
Can we up the stakes slightly? How about multiplying bread and fishes? Where's your corroborating evidence for that in the Bible?
Well, let me finish. So it's an inductive argument. So when we have numerous points of specific confirmation in the Gospels, then that is grounds for having for placing trust in what the Gospels say, even on those issues in which we cannot directly cross-check them.
Horse shit.
That's an inductive argument.
So if then V's example stands, and the aliens are among us apparently, Jonathan, each claim needs to stand or fall on its own merit, right? You don't get to point to absolutely mundane things so that you can prove without having to substantiate the not mundane things. Those things also have to be supported. So you're saying that the preponderance of evidence is going to point towards inductively those things. Where is your preponderance of evidence of multiplying bread and fishes, of walking on water, of casting out demons? Where are those things, Jonathan? Even if we granted you all of the mundanity of the Bible, show us the miracles, show us the magic. Because without even showing it's possible, how are we going to determine whether or not it's probable? Because that wouldn't even fit into Bayes. Show me a miracle first before you can show me that one was likely.
Well, I mean, how about the resurrection?
Sure. How many people resurrect from the dead after 3 days?
Exactly. But Jesus did, and that's why it's strong evidence for his claim.
Okay, so its unlikeliness makes it definitely true?
You just used that it's improbable as an example of why a coincidental version of your events would not be true, because it's improbable that it would be coincidence, but you're saying a singularity, which is even more improbable, is the truth?
The fact that Jesus' resurrection is a singularity and not something which occurs routinely.
The fact that it's in the book.
Why it has such epistemic value.
Yeah, the fact that it's in a book is entirely unremarkable. Show me that it happened before you can tell me that you can rely on it. Do the preponderance of scholars believe that Jesus resurrected from the dead after 3 days?
The evidence for it is very compelling.
I didn't ask you that. You're talking about scholars. You talked about the preponderance of evidence. Do people accept that Jesus rose from the dead? Because I'm pretty sure if we could prove that, we'd all be Christians, wouldn't we?
Well, what is universally or generally accepted by more than 90% of scholars is is that the disciples, after Jesus' death, had experiences which they interpreted as manifestations of the risen Christ.
And you also recognize that there are cult members who will take to their graves the assertion that they witnessed their cult leader perform miracles as well. That does not make it true. Even if I was generous enough to grant that those people saw things and that they truly believed it till the day that they died, that does not mean that what they saw correlates with what happened. You still need to show that what happened is possible.
But we have to look at the evidence.
Yes, where's the evidence, Jonathan?
The claims of the original apostles pertaining to the resurrection were such that the resurrection appearances were multi-sensory, involving not just single individual sightings, but group sightings, group conversations with Jesus, eating breakfast with Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and it was also extended across a 40-day time window. So it wasn't just one brief and confusing episode.
Why are you picking and choosing? Why are you picking and choosing?
What do you mean by that?
Well, there was also a zombie invasion at the time that should have been written by extra-biblical sources at least once, right? When the tabernacle was torn down, was that in Matthew 51 or is it Mark 41? I think, or 51.
Yeah.
Either way, there's an entire zombie apocalypse that's taken place right there. You would think somebody would have written that down, right? The fact is, you're talking about a book that was written mostly by authors that we don't even know. And to point at that and say, oh, no, it totally backs itself up, is how do you not understand that is entirely unremarkable? I can point at Harry Potter and say that, that all of these different magic spells happen, and just because I can show you, that London is an actual place and other places that are actually pointed out, don't substantiate the magic claims of it. Show that it's possible.
So what do you mean by show that it's possible? Do you mean logically possible?
Magic?
What do you mean when you say show that it's possible?
Sure. How many people raise up from the dead after 3 days of being actually factually dead? Because you got to admit, if Jesus was just in a coma, that really doesn't back up. Well, do you think Jesus was in a coma?
So are you saying that it's impossible in the sense that the probability is zero?
We're saying it's not possible in the sense that in the history of humankind, recording events like this and studying science that would give us insight into whether or not this could happen, this hasn't happened.
But you grant that...
Same with walking on water, multiplying bread and fishes, and all of that good stuff.
Any claim with a non-zero probability can, in principle, be demonstrated if you have sufficient evidence. Would you agree?
Okay,
yeah, monkeys flew out of my ass this morning.
So my counter would be the disciples had a mass hallucination that lasted for 40 days. Is that a probability of zero?
No, it's a very low probability.
Okay. Is it less probable than your claim? Because
considering we know that mass hallucinations exist?
And that we've recorded and seen them, at least we have a number there.
So I actually think that the probability of the resurrection is much higher than most skeptics grant. The reason being that the death and resurrection of Christ is the culmination and climax of the Hebrew Bible.
Who cares?
We have good reason. We have good reason.
No, you don't. Don't say good reason. Show me you have good reason. Don't just say it.
Show, don't tell.
I want you to have good reason. Saying I have good reason is not good reason. Show me. I want you to show me, Jonathan.
So I said that the cross and resurrection of Christ is the culmination and climax of the Hebrew Bible.
Who cares?
For instance,
why should I care about it being the climax of the Hebrew Bible?
Well, it significantly raises the probability, doesn't it?
No, it doesn't.
Why?
Yeah.
Frodo getting his finger cut off, bitten off at Mount Doom was the culmination of Lord of the Rings. That doesn't make it more probable that it happened.
Because it shows that God has plausible motivation for raising Jesus from the dead.
You're assuming that God is there, that Jesus is there, and that you're making a whole bunch of assumptions as true before you even walk into it. Why should we?
There? I mean, you're not a mythicist, right? Are you a mythicist, like?
You know what? To be honest, is it probable that there were itinerant rabbis at the time? Sure. Was Yeshua a name that was used at the time? I believe so.
I believe there were, 32, 38 different apocalypse cults that were in the area around that same time.
And that borrowing from that storyline is something that happened often and in that area at that time. Do I think that someone named Jesus could have led an apocalyptic cult? Sure, no problem, absolutely. Do I think that the events that are portrayed in the Bible are true? Why would I?
Because of the evidence.
Sure. I'm waiting for you to give some.
Well, I gave some earlier, but...
No, you gave evidence that Jesus talked to somebody that he might have relied on earlier. Why don't you give evidence for miracles?
But it's an inductive argument based on numerous points of historical confirmation in the Gospels, which shows that the Gospels generally are reliable and trustworthy.
Okay, you keep saying inductive. Please put that into a valid syllogism.
Why don't you put it into a valid syllogism?
Because
use Bayes' theorem. I deal in probabilities. I like to make the probability
because
or the uncertainty.
If you're going to keep saying inductive, then I need to know whether or not your argument is strong or weak, and I need to know that you even know what the fuck you're talking about. Because if you're going to keep using a word that you don't understand, then I would say just take that word out. Otherwise, please provide to me the syllogism that you are using. Provide to me this strong argument inductively for Christ.
Well, if there's numerous points of confirmation in the Gospels.
If there are numerous points of confirmation in the Bible, in the Gospels.
That provides an a priori basis for trusting the Gospels. I mean, we do this all the time. I mean,
that's not an
we
inductive
trust
argument.
People's testimony because they have a track record of being habitually trustworthy.
We also have a ton of information. We're learning more and more that eyewitness accounts, especially later on, and even as told in the Bibles many years later, in the books of the Bible, many, many years later, is horribly inaccurate. That's just how people work.
What's horribly inaccurate?
Eyewitness testimony.
In certain situations.
Like the ones you're bringing up.
Like in cases of severe trauma and grief and fear, when emotions are running high, and maybe when your leader has been killed. Yeah, I feel like there would probably be a little bit of problems in comprehending what was going on at the time.
Eyewitness testimony is typically unreliable on details in cases where there's a weapon or knife present, or where the participants are strangers to one another, or where the events happen very quickly over a period of seconds or minutes. But the resurrection encounters, by contrast, are extended.
Didn't Jesus get stabbed by a spear?
Yeah.
Does a spear not count?
Does a cross not count as a weapon? I feel like that counts as a weapon. I mean, maybe not a good one to bring into hand-to-hand combat, but...
The nails, at least. Jonathan?
Hello.
Hey. The thing is the reason we're coming on so strong is because you came on very strong, and as a person, I'm sure you're a really sweet guy. But when it comes to, whether or not we have evidence for something that's miraculous, the thing that you need to point out is miraculous things. That's how we determine whether or not it's true. And you're dancing, so stop dancing. Is there evidence for miracles?
Would you agree that the apostles claimed Jesus had risen from the dead and has appeared to them?
Well, I don't think that all of the books were actually named after people who wrote them. So
I would say that I agree that the people who wrote the Gospels said that happened.
So would you agree, for example, Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7.
Wait, Paul didn't see God, not Jesus.
He came way later.
Let me finish. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, "What I received to pass on to you as the first importance that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures. He was buried. He rose again on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and he appeared to Cephas and to the 12, and so forth." Would you accept that is strong evidence that the apostles claimed Jesus rose from the dead?
I would be concerned about taking Paul's words for anything, since he and like Peter and John and all of them had massive disagreements, and Paul's version of what happened was massively outside the scope of what the others agreed to at all.
Which can happen, especially when you're talking about something that you weren't even there for.
Right. That's probably a good thing not to do.
Yeah, I mean, even Christian scholars point and say that they cribbed notes off of each other. So that largely explains, without any magic, the idea that there are some themes that follow.
Do you have an example, V, on where Paul contradicts the apostles on the resurrection?
Not on the resurrection, but I think that there's ample evidence, both if you want to take it from the Bible itself or external sources, where there is a massive amount of disagreement between Peter and Paul.
Okay, give me an example.
Paul thinks that you don't need to be a Jew in order to be saved by Christ, and Peter did. Peter thought that you needed to be circumcised.
Show me where Peter said that.
This is external stuff, dude. I don't have sources in front of me, but this is common knowledge among biblical scholars, that Peter and Paul disagreed on things like circumcision, about Jewish heritage, and a bunch of other stuff as well.
Yeah, I mean, we can go into Galatians too, but this is a long discussion, which is off topic for what.
Yes, it is. I am curious because you brought up 4 potential options about the resurrection, right? Like the timing of it. Mm-hmm. It was coincidence, it was lied about, it was God, and it was Jesus coordinating his own death, right? Those are the 4?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you dismissed coincidence as improbable. I'm assuming you're also going to dismiss the others as improbable as well. That leaves you with the one that you like, but you say that the one you like is a singularity, and singularities are improbable. So if you're using improbability as the nixing factor for all of these, then you have to nix that one as well. So my question is, besides it being improbable, what is your justification for eliminating the other 3 in favor of your first one?
The way that Bayes' theorem works is that we ask, is your evidence more probable given your hypothesis or given the annulment of that hypothesis? So the fact that the example I gave was Jesus' death at the time of Passover, that's more probable. That evidence is more probable given the hypothesis than given the annulment of the hypothesis, and therefore it's evidence for that hypothesis. And then I would use other examples to build a cumulative argument in support of the conclusion.
What's the annulment of the hypothesis in this scenario?
That Jesus is not the Messiah.
So the hypothesis is that Jesus is the Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
The null hypothesis that he is not.
Right.
And your argument that he is that things happen during Passover.
Right.
Okay, that doesn't answer where we get that information from. You're still stuck with those 4 options.
What do you mean, where we got that information from?
Well, okay, if I grant you that this happened at Passover, that still leaves us with those 4 options, right? It was coincidence, it was a lie, right. It was God, or it wasn't God. It was Jesus orchestrating his own death.
But we know that it was, we have evidence against it being the apostles designing or manipulating the history to make it conform with the Old Testament in that case, because we were overwhelming evidence.
Where is this information?
Death at the time of Passover.
Where?
So it's reported in all 4 Gospels, and the Passion narratives are independent in the Gospels.
They're not, though.
Even Christian scholars have pointed to them cribbing off of each other.
No, they're not. Mark came first.
No, on the Passion narratives they are. Yes, they are.
Okay, hold on. So if you want to talk about the Passion narratives, then let's.
Yeah.
Right? How about the character of Jesus? Because they all disagreed, right? If you want to talk about Mark and Matthew, you have Jesus being this meek and mild, character, the one that pleaded, the one that went into the desert, the one that cried out, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" Right? And then in the next narrative, right, we'll bring up Luke. Luke was just this fucking superhero, right? Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. He's absolutely bravely stepping into it. And then you have John, who is just fucking intense, right? Saying, "Woman, behold your son," turning to the guards and saying, "I thirst, give me something to drink." It's wild how you're saying that they're all just the same, when the fact is, even in their own depictions of Christ, you have three very different types of characters. You have one who's a reluctant Messiah, which, by the way, makes sense when you look at the context in which that letter was written, right? And the others, you're talking about, another depiction, but those depictions don't line up. So no.
There's, Bart Ehrman makes that argument in his book, Jesus Interrupted, and it's a bad argument.
Why?
When he makes it, and it's a bad argument when you're making it right now.
Cool. Tell me why. And also, please, could you also actually tell me, let's say you were absolutely right that they were all together on the Passion story, right? Why do you believe them, especially when they can be pointed out that they weren't together in other places, right? So Eric can be wrong 9 times out of 10, but that 10th time that I really want him to be right, man, he's just right, because I want it to be.
Okay, so there's 2 points.
Yeah, go ahead.
Address. So the first one, so Bart Ehrman basically says that in Mark, Jesus feels forsaken on the cross, and and doesn't really understand why he's on the cross, why he's forsaken by God, and so forth. But that doesn't seem to be at all what Mark is doing. If you look at Mark 8:31, for example, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Mark 9:31, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, etc. Mark 10 says...
Are you reading us all of Mark right now?
Apparently. But
I'm giving plenty of examples from Mark which refute Bart Ehrman's argument on that, because there's numerous citations I could give in Mark where Mark...
Of Jesus being brave?
Jesus knows... What?
Of Jesus being... And we're just talking about the character of Christ. We're really far down a rabbit hole on this.
Yeah, we're already granting you so much, man.
That it happened. We're granting you that these people are the people who are labeled in the books, which we know is not true. We're granting you the story, and we're arguing over and quibbling over small things.
And I'm
the fact is,
your argument.
Okay. So you're right. The argument that I brought up was the character of Christ is different among those. And I really shouldn't have. I shouldn't have granted that. But go ahead.
So I gave a couple examples already from Mark if you want, but I won't bore you with them. But throughout the Gospel of Mark, we see that Jesus knows why he is knows about his death and his resurrection. He tells the disciples about it. He knows the mission for which he's been sent and so forth, which completely undermines Bart Ehrman's claim. The other point you raised was about contradictions in the Gospels, I think. Do you have a specific example in mind?
Okay, hold on. I'm kind of stuck on the last bit. So just because you have a prisoner who knows that they're going to the gallows, does that mean that it's impossible that they walked with the executioner to the gallows? No, and it also doesn't. That doesn't. No, but what else?
No, I was refuting the particular point that you were making from Bart Ehrman. Anyway, the other point was I was asking for specific examples of alleged contradictions.
No, he's talking about Bart Ehrman instead of me, which is a straw man argument, but that's fine. Jonathan?
No, it's an argument from Bart Ehrman that you were using, but what specific examples of gospel contradictions do you have?
Sure. The contradiction between reality and the claims made in it. Please help me there. When do people walk on water? How often have we been able to multiply bread and fishes? How many people stand up and walk away after having been dead, actual dead? Because if he wasn't really dead, then that's really not a miraculous claim. And cool, no problem. You're saying he fucking died, right? He bled out until water came, right? When he was stabbed. Help me here. Where is your evidence for these miraculous claims?
Well, first of all, can you defend your claim? You said that the Gospels are full of contradictions.
Yeah, I just gave you a few.
If you read Bart Ehrman, and you're bringing him up anyway, do you know his challenge to people to write out the Passion story consecutively using all 4 Gospels in a way that makes any kind of sense? Do you know that no one's been able to do that yet?
Why did you give a specific example?
No one has been able to do that yet. That's your example. He has been giving theology students and theology and apologists this test. Write out the Passion story using all 4 Gospels, incorporating all the evidence, all the detail from each one in a way that makes sense consecutively within the timeline, within the scope. No one can do it. No one's done that yet.
Okay. So I'm going to let you go here because I don't think you're giving any specific examples to back up your claims.
Okay, then here's a specific example. Jonathan, rising from the dead does not correlate to our understanding of reality. That is a contradiction.
And no one's claiming that Jesus rose naturally from the dead. We're claiming that God raised Jesus from the dead.
Okay, how probable is that?
Well, that is dependent on whether God exists.
Oh, it does, doesn't it?
And
you're right, because if God doesn't exist, that's not probable at all. That is infinitely improbable, isn't it? So you don't get to add that as a reason. It doesn't get to go onto the table of probability because you have to show that it's likely at all.
So as I said, I'm going to let you go.
Yeah,
but
I figure that's okay.
I mean, we can talk. I can talk about the existence of God if you want, but
I've been bringing this up this entire call. But if you've got to go, I totally understand. I would want to go too if I was getting pushed on having to back up the miracle claims.
Well, no, it's just not defending your points. You make general statements without giving specifics.
I just gave you one. Rising up from the dead after 3 days. There's your specific.
Yeah. And as I said, it's never been the claim of Christians that Jesus rose naturally from the dead.
Why are you adding that extra word, Jonathan? Why don't you try responding to my point instead of dancing around it? Please. How often do we see people get up and rise from the dead? Because this book, it's only useful so long as we already believe it, right? But after that, unless we're talking about, a hermeneutic understanding of the culture, it's fucking worthless. You got to actually show me why. So why don't you stand up, put your money where your mouth is, or fucking hang up and go?
You did.
Cool.
He's gone.
I didn't have to hang up. Fair enough.